least in the immediate term, is just make bad stuff cost money.
I think most of what we do in regards to legal education is try to undo it.
So much of what we do every day is just try to talk to people, not lawyers, not academics, not like, political power, but people, where power should be and exist.
Write op-eds, talk about what you're learning in law school and how completely effed up it is. Talk about the corporate influence on the law that you're seeing every single day.
You have access to different institutions and individuals and ways that you can influence the world around you from wherever you're sitting, and you probably have a lot of different ones.
And I think that there's something about this profession that teaches you that you should be afraid that if you ever close a door, and by closing a door, they mean not going to big law, that you are somehow going to ruin your life, even though, again, you have this immense privilege of obtaining a law degree.
What about your happiness? Like, does that not factor in? Do you not want to feel joy? Like, do you I need to do this because I don't want to risk not making all this money. It's like, okay, but what about like having time and like, spending time with your family? Are you not worried about that risk?
So I'm Suzanna. I am a 3L here at the Harvard Law School. I'm originally from Maryland, outside DC. And I took a class with Professor Hansen. I'm in the Critical Corporation Theory Lab. I'm also the outgoing president at H Lab here on campus. So really excited to be with you all today. Just a quick preamble. Before I started law school, I was nervous. I was asking people, like, what do you think I should do to prepare? And I got this one piece of advice, and it wasn't about like reading, getting to yes, or learning what a tort was, which I still don't know. It was about remember to be creative. And I think creativity is something that's not really talked about in law school. There seem to be set tracks, set classes, set narratives, and we get a lot of pressure into following those. But I think that, and those tracks can be very harmful. I think in part that's why we're all here today, is to name that these are harmful and to hopefully deconstruct them. But I think deconstruction is an important but first step of this process. I think you also need to create and to build and to try to get into messy things and find solutions. So that's why I'm so excited to have this group of panelists here, both here in person and behind me, looming, to share more about their creativity and how they bring the sense of creation and construction into the work that they do. Just some things to keep in mind, especially for the law students that are in the audience. How are the strategies that we're going to hear more about? How do they expand our understanding of what one could do with a legal career or as a lawyer? How are these folks so creative? And also, why is it that our legal educations don't often name this type of work or propose this type of work in the limited set options that we are presented? So without further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce you to our panelists. I'm so excited to see everyone. Hey guys, how's it going? You can't see me, I don't think, but we can see you. I'll ask our panelists to get us started by sharing your name, your organization, and then a big question, but hopefully on the briefer side, if you could share your theory of change for your work. So Molly, you're right to my left, so if you wouldn't mind to get us going, we're so happy to have you here today.
Yeah, awesome. I have the privilege and also fear of being the only person here, so we'll see how this goes with me in person and everybody else on Zoom. So my name is Molly Coleman, pronouns are she, her. I'm the executive director of People's Parity Project, which is a nonprofit organization that a couple of classmates and I founded not very long ago when we were students here at HLS. We started PPP when we were 1Ls and are now coming up on 5 years of organizing, 3-ish years of being a real organization and not just like a group of students sitting in Belinda complaining about this law school and the legal profession. So quickly on our theory of change, when we started organizing, it was because we recognized that what lawyers do, what happens in places like Harvard and other law schools matters. For better or for worse, it affects what the world looks like. And you can complain about that all you want, and again, we definitely do, because I think generally it's been to make the world a worse place, but it's a fact that we who have the incredible privilege of earning law degrees and becoming lawyers are going to shape the world for better or for worse. for far too often, that has been for the worse. And so our organizing principle was that we had an obligation as members of this profession to organize within it and try to do better, and try to force our peers within the profession to do better than what law schools expect of them and what kind of the status quo for lawyers expects of them. The other piece of this, and I think something that I was hearing in the last panel, and I think really relates to what is happening here at this conference this weekend, is the idea that there are a lot of students who come into law school who would describe themselves as progressive, left of center, liberal, maybe even lefty, who leave law school spending their lives devoted to serving corporate power, to serving corporate interests, and to ensuring that the world continues to be ruled by unelected judges who have spent their lives defending corporate interests. And we wanted to think through, and still strive every single day to think through how to change that and what it might look like to build a profession in which people who are left of center, progressive, lefty, are actually spending their careers doing work that embodies those values. We think that the best way to get people to stay true to their values is to do two things: build community, which you do through organizing, through doing the actual work. And that's how you hold each other accountable. That's how you develop the skills that you need to have careers serving the public good. And that's how we ultimately build a profession that is no longer a force for just like pure evil in the world all the time. So it's not super short, but that is the quickest I can do our theory of change, and really excited for this conversation.
That was great. Thank you so much. Sparky, could you go next, please?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Sparky Abraham. I am the legal strategist for the Debt Collective, which is a large union of debtors, I think maybe the nation's first, at least nationwide union of debtors. I'm also the founder of Jubilee Legal, which is, it's just me, a solo practice doing consumer and debt law in California. I think my theory of change, so to speak, at least in the immediate term, is just make bad stuff cost money. And that's the angle that I try to take, for all the different approaches. Is this going to make bad stuff cost more money than the people who were doing it expected it to cost? I think that's it.
Bianca, would you mind introducing yourself and sharing your theory of change?
Really excited to be here. My name is Bianca Tylek, pronouns she, her, and I'm the founder and executive director of Worth Rises. Really excited to hear Molly still refer to the space as Belinda. I don't know if that's still happening, but we didn't overlap at all and we named that space. So that is just exciting to see a legacy of change and revolution in institutions. Worth Rises, we are an organization that works to dismantle the prison industry and to end the exploitation of people who are incarcerated and their loved one. And our theory of change, there's some fancy language on our site, but I think the closing sentence sort of says it all, which is that if we can remove the financial incentives to lock people up, we can keep people out. And so that's really what we do. We are about removing the barriers to true transformational change in our system that will allow for liberation. By removing the corporate actors and profiteers and sort of public-private partnerships that exacerbate exploitation, so that we can protect communities, but most importantly, really dismantle a system that has never served us.
Great, thank you so much. And Charity.
Great, it's great to be here. So my name is Parity, Ryerson. I'm the executive director and founder of Corporate Accountability Lab. We are a Chicago-based nonprofit. We've got about 7 attorneys. We focus on global supply chain abuses by companies. So think about factory workers that produce our clothes, or farm workers who produce the food that we eat around the world, and the way that corporate behavior is inherently problematic for these broad communities across, especially the global South. As we think about this idea of corporate power and the way that the system is kind of structured against these communities, it's obvious, and I think I really like what Sparky said, that part of the theory of change is just making bad stuff cost more. So before I founded the organization, I spent a lot of time suing multinationals, trying to say, well, it's really cheap to violate human rights and to harm the environment. We just need to make this cost more because that's the only thing that changes their decision making. I would say beyond that, the other kind of maybe lens of analysis for our theory of change is just social location. So we all have so many different accesses to power in different ways, whether we are in a prison, whether we are in a housing project, whether we are at Harvard Law School, you have access to different institutions and individuals and ways that you can influence the world around you from wherever you're sitting, and you probably have a lot of different ones. So for Cal, sometimes that means that we're a US-based organization. And when you do global work, there's a lot of problems with having power, including global North nonprofits, kind of based in these countries. And at the same time, the United States has the most powerful consumer market in the world. A lot of our legal regimes influence the ways that global supply chains are built. So if we don't change them here, where the legal culture is generated from, then they're going to remain as abusive as they are currently.
Great, thank you so much. So I like to direct this question to Charity and Molly. So I'm going to try to hold this mic so you can hear me. So, being a lawyer engaging in this legal field can sometimes comes with a reputation that, I think is often well earned for being very abrasive or rigid. And I can imagine that this reputation and the nuggets of truth within it can make it challenging for those in the legal profession to envision new ways of doing things, envisioning new ways of pushing back against corporate power. So, you both throughout your work mentioned, thinking about strategy and new ways of doing things. So what strategies have you used to encourage lawyers and those in the legal field to challenge the injustices inherent in their work that might be challenging for them to see beyond or to envision new things?
Charity, you want to take it? Or start with
Yeah, sure, I can go first. I first want to push back on the framing of the question.
Oh,
Just
perfect,
to say
thank
that,
you.
Yes, lawyers can be abrasive, I guess, as a profession. Maybe that's what we are. But I think that for many of us, we were activists before we were lawyers. And frankly, if you're in activism or social movement building and you haven't developed some enemies, then you're probably not very effective. You're not actually making change. There's not a situation in which you're coming up against a massive system that is structured in order to harm certain groups, where the people who benefit from that system are going to be like, oh, cool, you want to change this? That's great. I have no problem with that. That's not how this works. So if you are not perceived as abrasive, or if you're not pushing boundaries somewhere, you probably are not really making very effective change. And so I guess, maybe that also is my answer here. I think that as we, one area where we probably do a little bit more in terms of outreach, because typically, we're the guys that sue the companies. So we're not talking to the CSR people. We're not doing direct brand engagement. If you see us, you're probably going to see us in court and you're not going to be happy about it. So in that sense, we're not doing a ton of outreach to sort of bring people over. We're more trying to change incentives to change behavior, and it's kind of as simple as that. However, we do a lot of work we try to do a lot of work with law firms to do pro bono projects. And this is an area in which I think we have opportunities to talk to lawyers about the way that their work impacts the world. But just as a practical matter, the vast majority of the projects that we do, eventually the attorneys will get conflicted out. So the reality is corporate law firms, they're funded by corporations, and maybe they don't have a direct conflict because they don't work in the cocoa sector or the sugar sector or in the apparel sector or some other sector that we might be targeting, but it creates positional conflict. So we often lose our pro bono partners because they don't want to take positions against the company that they wouldn't want, that they would have to take the other side of in the future. So it means that the vast majority of jobs, the vast majority of resources available here are all against us. And it's really hard to kind of pull people over to the other side once they've entered. So when you leave law school and you go join a corporate firm, those golden handcuffs are real, but it's also it's tough to flip sides back and forth. So I think that when people are making decisions about where they want to go out of law school, I think the idea that you come out and you work a couple years in the firm and you pay off your student loans and then you come back into public sector, that happens sometimes. But in my experience, it's a very small minority and it's hard to do. So that sort of answers your question, but I think I walked around it. So I'll pass it to Molly to actually answer your question.
I don't know if I'm going to fully answer it either, in part because when I think about what we see as, the character traits of law students and lawyers that prevent effective organizing, I think less about folks being abrasive, less about them being rigid, and more just about the fear that I think is so pervasive in this profession and how unfounded that fear is. I think that one of the things that really stood out to me when I was in law school is how over the course of 3 years, I became more afraid about my future career paths. I became more afraid about how to pay my rent than when I had been making a lot less money than I make now in public interest work post-law school. I became afraid of closing doors, even though I was at Harvard Law School with every single door that I could ever want being open to me. And I saw that over and over again with my peers, and I continue to see that with the students who organize with PPP on their respective law campuses. And I think that there's something about this profession that teaches you that you should be afraid that if you ever close a door, and by closing a door, they mean not going to big law, that you are somehow going to ruin your life, even though, again, you have this immense, immense privilege of obtaining a law degree. And I think that there are a couple of ways that we've really tried to push back on that fear. One is to show people that if you want an awesome job doing public interest lawyering, the best way to get one of those jobs is to do awesome, cool, incredible organizing work when you're in law school or on campus. That's going to be the way that you meet really incredible attorneys. That's the way that you're going to meet people who you want to emulate your career after. And it's how you're eventually going to get in those doors that you want to be kept open, not the doors that the law school is trying to shove you through. So I think showing people that organizing, activism, pushing back against the status quo can be a part of a fruitful career is really, really critical to combating that fear. Another thing that we really try to emphasize is that it's just more fun to be less fearful, and that it's actually more fun to, think about, okay, like, is it kind of fun to go to a big law reception and like hobnob over fancy cocktails and appetizers? Like, sure, yeah, everybody likes a free drink. Is it more fun to go protest at a law firm and get the cops called on you and get to laugh at how afraid these big law firm partners are? Yeah, for sure, that's way more fun. We have way better parties on our side. We have way more to celebrate. Like, it is just more fun to let that fear go and to enjoy your life and to do work that makes you proud and to be around people who are doing that same work and who inspire you and motivate you and are like talking about cool things and not mergers and acquisitions all the time. So I think, again, like, this isn't rocket science. I'm not saying that this all works all the time, but I do think that combating that fear, reminding people that you can have a fun, fulfilling professional career and personal life when you are doing this work that, some folks might frown on, but the right people are going to think is actually really cool and be really excited about, is something that we found to be really effective. And I think once you bring people into these spaces, once you get people to realize that this is fun, to realize that this can be professionally fulfilling and professionally valuable, you get people to start bringing back that creativity and bringing back that strategic thinking that they had before law school, but that, this profession tries to squeeze out of you. So again, not fully responsive to the question, but that's how we've tried to kind of combat some of those personality traits that I think can be harmful within the profession.
Great, thank you so much. Bianca and Sparky, this next question is for you. While reviewing your work and indeed all the work of the panelists here, I was really struck by your use of storytelling as a part of your organizing and your strategy to break down really complex and challenging topics to reach your organizing base and to reach the folks that you're hoping to connect with to do your work. And so my question for you is, how do you think about narrative and storytelling as a tool to fight back against corporate power, and what are some tactics that you've seen in your work as being particularly effective?
I'm happy to start. I think storytelling is absolutely critical to the work we do, because the only stories we hear are those from the corporations and those who basically own politics, media, and power in this country, right? I think it's really interesting. We focus on not just the stories we tell, but the messages that are coming across, the language that we use. Even the simple language of corporation versus company is critical. Studies have shown that when you talk about companies, people think of small business and are actually much more likely to sort of side and feel empathy. If you talk about corporations, people are much less likely to present empathetically towards corporate conglomerates and things of that sort. So we focus on every sort of piece of this. But I think when it comes to storytelling, I think of law school and the space that it's not created for people who are, Black and brown, for people of low income, for people who come from all sorts of types of marginalized backgrounds. And then that's sort of reinforced by educating us all in a language, right? And sort of saying that this language is our language, the language of the legal profession, and therefore so completely and utterly inaccessible to anyone else. And, law is just that difficult. It's not difficult. I'm sorry, I'm just gonna frame that, right? And the reality is we have this legal language. So much of what we do every day is just try to talk to people, not lawyers, not academics, not like, political power, but people, where power should be and exist. And so we focus on making all of our materials, everything that we do, accessible. And part of making things accessible is to tell stories that people can identify with, empathize with, and understand in just plain old English, right? I always sort of joke that like so much of law school is about learning how to interpret the law, because it's really about learning a new language, when what it should be about is learning how to write law and change the laws that don't work for you. I didn't graduate from law school and ever practice law because I don't believe I want to interpret these laws. I think they're terrible in most cases, right? And so we use storytelling in all of our campaigns. We work with directly impacted community members to tell their stories in their words. And I think that's really the critical reality, is that as advocates, we should be elevating and amplifying the voices of people who have these direct experience, who are close enough to the issue and know what they need, and not be paternalistic and think that we need to be the ones to translate or somehow convey their stories, that in fact they have the words and the experience to do that themselves. And so we've done a lot of video content. We've done storytelling through like op-eds or letters to the editor. We help people tell their story and do ghostwriting. We don't need to be on anything. We don't need credit in that way. What we really want is them to feel powerful in their story and to feel like people who are suffering alongside them can be represented by one of their own.
So I've really come around in my personal journey as a lawyer to being, I think, basically like a story and storytelling maximalist. I think that sometimes when you think about this stuff, you think, okay, well, storytelling is really important for whatever happens outside of litigation, for example. And I think actually story is everything, everywhere that you are. And so some of the ways that this kind of plays into the work, right? I think what Bianca said is really important in terms of letting people, oftentimes lawyers want to come in and say, okay, you tell me the facts and then let me kind of put together. No, people can tell their stories far better than you can for, 99% of the time until you really basically live it with them. And one of the most powerful things that we get to do at the Debt Collective is have debtors' assemblies where people come together to talk about their debts, right? Being in debt is often a very isolating and stigmatizing experience. It's something that people don't talk about. They have a lot of shame over. And having a meeting, having a place where people come together and talk about their shared experience is really, really empowering and really helpful and really freeing. But, if you just kind of zoom back and think, okay, stop thinking, okay, we're having a meeting where it's all people are doing is they're telling their story. And folks are connecting with each other's stories and relating to it, which is all that we're doing whenever we're connecting with any story, fiction or nonfiction or whatever. We're kind of relating and empathizing with it. And so, it's so huge and so central to all of the organizing work that we do. And then again, I think that translates directly into the more cut and dried legal work, in terms of litigation. Okay, yeah, you think that you have to focus all about the law, and it's all about, the legal provisions and the ins and outs. No. The primary thing is the story. If you can tell a story that's going to be compelling to your audience, whether that's the jury or the judge or the arbitrator or the magistrate or maybe sometimes the clerk, that's the thing that's going to make the difference. And I think about the phrase that folks use of bad facts make bad law. No, I think actually bad stories make bad law. The facts are just kind of the components, but our whole goal, our whole approach to everything we do, the approach that I'm coming around to is no, we need to be 100% about the story. Whatever we are doing in terms of knowing the law or working with the law is just getting us to the place where we can help our client or our members or whoever tell their story in the most effective and and loud way.
Yeah, I love something that Sparky said made me think of a campaign that we have in a way in which we've used storytelling. And I think, Sparky is right on that storytelling is the most important thing in just about every venue. And we can talk about the courtroom. A lot of our work is around policy change, right? And sure, I'm a policy expert, but I can absolutely tell you that it is not compelling policy arguments that makes legislators change their minds on a particular policy. It is about hearing from people. And what that also does is it also gets you away from the political divide. People are people, and it doesn't matter whether you're a Republican, you're a Democrat, or wherever you sit in the middle. When you are hearing real people's stories, you cannot deny real experiences and what people have endured and suffered through, no matter who you are. So, wherever your political alignments are, wherever your policy biases are, when you are hearing from real people and you hear people and their suffering and in their words and you can't say no to that. And so oftentimes I get advocates who come to me and they say, okay, we're in our state. So just as a base example, we lead a lot of campaigns to make communication in prisons and jails free. We passed the first piece of legislation in the country to do that in 2018. And since then have passed several counties and now 2 states, and we have about a dozen states that are considering legislation this year. When we did this for the first time in Connecticut, we had a 12-hour hearing because we showed up with 200 people to tell their stories of the cost of communication and what it had done to their families when their loved one was incarcerated. In the middle of that hearing, the chair of the committee announced to the committee that he was behind in supporting the bill. And solely because of what happened in that room and the fact that those legislators had to stay on that call till 11 o'clock at night, listening to people talk about what has happened to their families. And so when I hear advocates reach out to me and they say, okay, all the legislators we've talked to, are bought into the policy, but they don't know how they're going to pay for it. And that's our big hurdle. What I tell them all the time is they haven't bought into your policy. Because when somebody's bought into your policy and to what actually needs to happen, they will figure out a way to do their part of the job, which is find the money for it. Budgets, like anything else, are moral documents that reflect the priorities of a community. And that all gets established with stories.
Yeah, it's funny, sorry, and I don't know, Bianca, if you've had this experience too, but I feel like, particularly coming out of law school and a lot of lawyers, to the extent that they think about storytelling at all, it's so often so one-dimensional. It's like, okay, here's my client, and I need to portray how they are a very sympathetic angel who has done nothing wrong, and everything in the world has happened bad to them, and that's the focus. And then, you talk to people who are actually good at this stuff and good organizers and, good trial attorneys and whoever else. It's like that's not, we all know that's not a compelling story. Kind of from your non-lawyer life, what makes a story interesting, what makes it compelling, what makes it relatable. It's not having one, perfect but set upon person. And, to a much larger extent, the more interesting thing is the villain. And that's often why, that's often the most effective focus for storytelling and narrative is who is the villain and what are they doing, and not trying to, because I think that a lot of things, something people often forget about too is we're all contrary. If you come to me and you start talking for an hour about how your client is perfect and has never done anything wrong, the first thing I'm thinking is, no, I don't think so. And just kind of, keeping this stuff in mind and keeping the human dynamics in mind is something that is just completely not just not taught in law school, but I feel like anti-taught.
I want to quickly see if Molly or Charity, if you have any thoughts on storytelling before. I saw you both nodding a little bit, but.
Molly, you go first this time.
I have a million thoughts. I think this is such a critical discussion, and something that Bianca said at the beginning of this conversation really jumped out to me, and that's thinking about how law school trains you to not be able to tell stories, and how you're taught to speak this different language, and you're taught that is the language of professional elites, and that's how you should be talking all the time, and how horrible the way they teach you to talk and write in law school is, and how ineffective it is when you want to create change. I haven't litigated. I'm never going to litigate. Maybe it works in a courtroom. It sounds like it probably does not work there either. But I think that there's, I guess, just two things that I'll say. One is that for the law students in the room, I think that you're really well positioned to remember how you spoke before you went to law school. And I would just really encourage folks to keep honing that. One of the things that we work with our organizers on a lot, and somebody brought this up, is you start ghostwriting. Start writing, or write in under your own name. Write op-eds. Talk about what you're learning in law school and how completely effed up it is. Talk about the corporate influence on the law that you're seeing every single day. Figure out how to tell that story now, because it's not going to get easier if you wait 5-10 years into your legal career. The other just quick example that I'll give of kind of the importance of storytelling is around the issue of forced arbitration, which I'm sure many of you have heard about. I won't go into it. There's been a sea change in the last few years in how people talk about forced arbitration, and it's because there have been better storytellers who have been involved in the issue. When folks started organizing to combat forced arbitration, the phrases that they used to describe it, no offense, there are probably people in this room who are a part of that early organizing, they did really important work, and they called it like pre-dispute mandatory binding arbitration clauses. And I think forced arbitration is really awful, and there's no chance I'm getting out of bed to fight to end mandatory pre-dispute binding arbitration clauses.
Rolls off the tongue.
What does that even mean? Then people came around and were like, what if we called this forced arbitration? And people were like, oh, forced arbitration, that sounds really bad. And everybody was like, oh yeah, this is good. We can start to organize. People started telling stories about what it meant to sign away their rights in a contract and how that impacted their ability to recover when they were wronged in the workplace or as a consumer. And all of a sudden, we started to see policy changes. We've started to see legislation pass, at least the House, hopefully one day the Senate. There are real impacts to becoming better storytellers, especially when you're thinking about these really wonky legal issues that have such a massive impact on people's lives. Figuring out how to talk about them in a way that is relatable and gets to the actual root of the problem and not just like the legal stakes is so critical. And again, I think it's something that everybody is able to do, but I encourage people to do it as early as possible, because I do think it's a skill that lawyers lose over time.
I know this question's taking over everything, so I'll try to be quick. I know you have more. One, I think, just bouncing off what Molly just said, this idea of pre-dispute mandatory arbitration, that is storytelling. That is the storytelling of the person who's trying to preserve the status quo. They want your eyes to glaze over so that you're not focused on it. And so when you see these very technical terms, there's a real reason to do that. They want you to just kind of look away and say, I don't know what that's about. And that's how you maintain this kind of power in ways that are really obviously unjust. But if it's not the status quo, that's where the need of storytelling is so much greater. We need to pull people out of that space and into one where they can see it differently. So I thought that was a really excellent example that you just gave. The other example, which kind of relates to something that Sparky just said, thinking about, the jury as the jury or the judge, or who is kind of your audience for one of these stories that you're telling. We're working right now with a group of forced laborers in the Dominican Republic who are all of Haitian descent. We got withhold release order. We got the sugar coming from the biggest sugar company in it's called Central Romana, but in the Dominican Republic, blocked from entry to the U.S. on the basis of forced labor. But as we're working on this, we're going, and a couple of weeks ago I was down there and talking to all the workers, I'm getting their stories. We're going, okay, does this hit this ILO indicator? Is this going to give rise to a trafficking statute claim? So we're really focused on the legal merits of it. When I'm going and talking to people at the Ways and Means Committee or at USTR, I'm focusing on these these very specific legal claims. But a couple days ago, I was in a call with a group of colleagues, and I just said, but here's the real rub of it. I talked to a guy who was kidnapped from Haiti when he was 14, brought over the border. He now is 75, and he's been working ever since at Central Romana as a forced laborer, and he showed me a machete wound that he got last week. This is just an extension of historical slavery. This is really subject to reparations. We're at a point where this is just where slavery just never ended for a 112-year-old company, and suddenly everyone said, oh my God, you're right. But when I was talking about, we're trying to figure out if there was illegal deductions on the pay slips, and we're trying to, this stuff, yes, it's important for your legal case, but when you're really trying to make progress on something that goes beyond just the narrow working it through on the papers, that kind of story of, well, he was brought as a slave, he's worked as a slave, this man is still a slave, and that's just the system in which he lives and which is still the system in place. That's a completely different kind of move. So I think this is a really valid and important conversation that I've been thinking about a lot myself in my own work this week.
And if I can, just jump on two quick things. So one, I love what I think Charity said in her first point, and I wanted to about this idea that like some language is meant to make you like gloss over it and not pay attention. I would argue that there is also language that is meant to actually do active harm. I like to say not every slogan is trademarked. There is language that is intentionally put into our lexicon to drive particular behavior, even though you don't know where that language came from. And I think Charity made an excellent point. It's someone's stories. I would also argue it's someone's language. I hear from journalists all the time, well, we can't use advocacy language. And I'm like, okay, sure, but you're also using police language. So like you're choosing a language and the question is whose language? You didn't derive that language by yourself. And a great example of that is in the prison telecom space, they invented the term video visitation. Not once have you ever FaceTimed your sister and said, I'm about to visit you, right? And yet the reason they did this is because they were encouraging at the time agencies, prisons and jails to do away with in-person, regular, real visits and replace them with their video costly kiosks so that they could make money. And then this term, video visitation, became ubiquitous around the prison telecom industry. And it's like, hold on, that's not real language. And then you get journalists saying, well, we're just using what the system is called. It's like, no, you're using language that is actually factually incorrect and, offering or furthering a particular agenda. So language is so critical. And then the other thing I was going to say is around this concept of storytelling, as Sparky, I think, was sort of saying, think about what are compelling stories to you, and the perfect character in any narrative is not interesting. And this idea of like what it means to actually show people who are and have them explain their own suffering. We're, right now in Charity's example made me think of this. Right now we're running a campaign to amend the 13th Amendment. Or I should say not amend the 13th Amendment, but pass a new amendment, because you can't actually amend an amendment, right? Fun fact, you didn't learn in law school. So in any case, the 13th Amendment, which is the amendment that has purported to abolish slavery, has in fact a giant exception clause in it that says except as punishment for a crime. And what that has meant is that for millions, over 70 million Americans who have a criminal conviction, 1.5 million people who are in prison, they can legally be enslaved. They are not protected from the 13th Amendment in any way. And to Charity's point, it's like we walked around saying like, hey, this clause inside of this like language feels like it's wrong. Slavery is wrong all the time. And then we had somebody who was formerly incarcerated on our staff who came up with the idea and said, we need to stop talking about it as if it's just like these 14 words in some legal document called the Constitution, but that it's actually except for me. Like I am the person right here. And so we actually did a storytelling campaign called Except for Me. And we had 13 formerly incarcerated people tell their stories in 2 minutes and 20 seconds that we could post on Twitter. That was like very cleanly. And we actually used, we got pro bono services from not a law firm, not from an advertising and marketing company, right? Whose only job in our society is to tell us fucking stories, excuse my language, right? They just tell us stories all day long that we somehow figure out, like, believe, don't believe, but the whole point is like buy their product or for whoever they're, doing marketing for. If we as like social justice agents had the resources for storytelling through advertising and marketing that our opponents have, we would be in a completely different place. And we were so lucky when a major advertising firm said, we are behind this campaign and we want to donate. And they donated $500,000 in like pro bono advertising services to help us tell these stories behind an activation series called Except for Me. And so, really, and I will say just one quick note, there was somebody who, when they were telling their story, I was doing all the interviews, and one of the questions I asked was like, what did you like doing as a young person, right, before you went to prison? And one person's actual response was, I like selling drugs. And there was a moment where we were like, okay, we've got like 45 minutes of content to edit down to 2 minutes and 20 seconds. Do we include that and do we not? And we did. And we did because one of the most compelling things is a redemption story. And what he said after that mattered a lot, right? And so, yes, people are allowed to be imperfect. Yes, language is so important. And storytelling, like, beyond convincing.
Thank you all so much. A lot of awesome stuff, and it was great to hear. And sorry, I can't look at you and speak into this mic, so I'll just look at you, Molly. But it was great to hear like how like your experiences and perspectives like tie together. And leading us into our next question, we don't really talk about, as discussed, storytelling or creative methods in law school, right? We talk about things that are like substantive due process, right? Like it's a mouthful. And so how do you see like the state of legal education, both inside or outside, state of education in generally? How do you see education, legal education especially, as shaping your organization and the ways in which that you're all able to pursue change? And I'll open this up for the group.
I mean, I could go quickly and just say, I think most of what we do in regards to legal education is try to undo it. I get tons of legal interns and new attorneys, and they are so anxious and insecure, per Molly's prior point about the amount of anxiety and fear that law school generates. And it's not even just law school itself. The day that you walk in on your first day of 1L and you've gone through the LSAT and the admissions process, you're already a bundle of nerves, right? You're afraid. You're afraid, and they're going to keep sort of pushing you on that. You might have a professor that's using the steps method, which is like, kind of abusive. You might have, there's all sorts of things about the way legal education functions that makes us all fearful and sort of makes us want to cling things to ourselves. We're worried about our salaries and how are we going to pay back our debt and how are we going to, all of this crap, right? So when someone comes into my office as a new attorney or as a legal intern, there's a huge challenge just to help people build confidence enough to do their job well, because that anxiety is debilitating. And what I need are people who can go and they can organize and they can speak in large groups and they're not afraid to be wrong and who can embrace failure and who are able to innovate. We run our organization as an innovation lab, so we use a design thinking process, and a huge part of design thinking is creative confidence. Are you willing to try and fail and try and fail and try and fail and do it publicly and learn from your failure? Are you able to have really bad ideas in front of your colleagues? Those things are so much more important than any technical knowledge of the law. So yes, be a good legal researcher. Yes, be a good legal writer. Do I care if you absorbed everything that happened in 1L contracts class, even if what I have you working on is contracts? No, you have to go look that up anyway, right? You learned this in such a general way. All this content, all of your grades, all this does not really matter to me. What matters is, did you do meaningful internships? Did you get out there and get some real world experience? Have you worked with impacted communities, or do you identify with impacted communities and have some personal experience? Do you have a foreign language? That's what matters. The rest of your law school transcript I don't care about, and I think that if you can come out with confidence and lack of anxiety, that's the most important job skill that you need for this kind of work.
I can go. I think that I have maybe not exactly the direction that the question is asking, but for me personally and for the Debt Collective as an organization, education is just this really, really important central aspect of our work and of our narrative and of our sort of vision of the world, right? I mean, and you can draw a direct line through the beginnings of the Debt Collective and debtor organizing at Occupy Wall Street to the Corinthian student debt strike in 2014 and 2015, when such an idea was still insane, and you would get laughed at on cable TV for suggesting that the federal government might someday cancel student debt, to the government announcing that all the Corinthian students were going to have their federal debt canceled. And now the administration, they just put out a video this morning about all the people in all the states who applied for the debt cancellation and how these forces are blocking it. So talk about power of storytelling and having people tell their own stories. But because so much of the work has come through student debt, because so much of our vision has been formed around an idea of education as something truly intrinsically valuable, as something that people actually like and want and need, which I think is true, and contrasting that against the way that it operates and exists in the world right now, including and especially legal education, right, where you go and then you come out with a massive amount of debt that applies pressure on you to take certain kinds of jobs. That narrative is out in the world too, although I think from anecdotes and I think from some data, it's not necessarily true that actually people are taking law firm jobs just because they have to make their loan payments. But in any case, it's really, I really cling to the idea that education, including legal education, should be something that serves a public good, a public purpose that is personally enriching, and that does not need to be tied to our future earning potential and our value in the labor market. And so I think that like I actually mostly had that experience for the most part. And back to kind of the early discussion about risk aversion, when people talk about risk aversion, particularly in terms of like their plans and their legal careers, I feel like you're missing the biggest risk. I mean, this is kind of what you all were saying at the beginning too, but like, what about your happiness? Like, does that not factor in? Do you not want to feel joy? Like, do you like, yeah, I need to do this because I don't want to risk not making all this money. It's like, okay, but what about like having time and like, spending time with your family? Are you not worried about that risk? So anyway, that's rambling and kind of brings together a few of these threads, but I do think that there is a version of education broadly, and especially legal education, that can and should serve our needs as individuals and as a society on such better premises and in such a better way than it currently does.
I'll just say I didn't go to law school hoping to practice law. I didn't come out of law school practicing law. I just had a very different vision for the purpose of going to law school. I also took a lot of classes at HBS, at HKS. Like I viewed it truly as an educational, informative opportunity, not one that simply was about directing a particular type of professional career. I run an organization where I am the only attorney. So I also don't think that like you need to start an organization that has just a bunch of attorneys. We get law school students every once in a while who want to intern. And the first thing I say is like, are you okay not doing legal work? Because that's not necessarily always like what you're going to do. You're going to do organizing. You're going to do a whole bunch of other stuff. Now, certainly law degrees can be helpful from time to time, particularly we're doing some of our regulatory work or we're drafting legislation. I really want to stress that over and over, especially, as we were talking about creativity, is like there's nothing more creative that you can do than literally write law, rather than think about, how to apply the current law as it exists. And you don't need a law degree to do that, because one of the things we do is we actually have model legislation, and then we sit down with the whole community and we walk them through every single line and ask them, like, does this serve your needs? Or is there something else that you need in here? We try to dispel the myth that like the law is only for people who have gone to law school, that it's scary and you can't understand it. You can actually write pretty simple laws. And certainly some things get more complicated. I won't, lie about that. But I think, making sort of what you have in law school, like accessible to other people, and in many cases what you don't have in law school, accessible to other people. And so, it happens pretty often to me that I will be chatting with somebody who's known me for like 2 years and something comes up about law school and they'll be like, I literally didn't know you were an attorney. And I really urge all of you to have that, not have law school be your identity, not to have being an attorney being your identity, right? It's a skill set, it's a toolkit, but it's not an identity. And so, I think those are the kind of basic things I can say about like how law or the legal system, obviously the legal system very much impacts my our organization were entirely, around the criminal legal system. But I think, just really actually dispelling the myth that it is the end all be all. There's just so much more.
I'll quickly just bring this back around to where Charity started it, which is at PPP, so much of what we do is bringing together people who want to unlearn what they learned in law school or think really quite differently about what they learned in law school. and I think the biggest frustration that we see amongst our organizers is that they've been taught this notion through their core classes that that there is something called the law. And that is it is correct, it is unchangeable, because it's been this way for a really long time, it is undeniably correct. And for anybody who sat through a law school class, you know that doesn't sit right. Because it's not true. And so, I think about like day one in common law, you study Marbury v. Madison, and it's like, well, right, this is the power of the Supreme Court. What? This was literally a power grab by a bunch of old white men so that they could control the future of the country indefinitely. Why are we accepting that as if this is a fact and this is how our country has to be? When you sit there in that class, I think that there's a lot of frustration, there's a lot of feeling like this is not right, but there isn't always an outlet to think about how to change that. And this actually came up on the last panel, somebody asked, what do we do about all of this? And somebody said you organize, you take direct action, you think about what is the collective power of folks who are being required to learn this so that they can graduate and get their degree. How do you change what you're being taught and how you're being taught the information in the curriculum? That's not going to come from John Manning. It's not, no law school dean is going to be like, what if we really radicalized how we teach the law at this school? It's never going to happen. There will only be change if people think about their collective power and think about how to force schools to teach the law in the way that it should be taught. And that's as a construct built by largely white men, currently largely former corporate attorneys and prosecutors, right? That can change, but people have to organize to change it, and people have to demand better and think about how are we demanding that the law be taught in the way that it should be. And I think that is, when we talk about organizing where you are, when you are in law school, you should be thinking about how to change your law school experience, what you are being taught in your core classes. As a lawyer, once you are out into the world and have the influence that alumni have, how are you going back and putting pressure on your schools, on your former schools, to think about what could they be doing differently for the next generation of lawyers? Because if we keep teaching the law the way that it's taught, we will continue to have the legal system that we have, and that isn't serving anybody. So, that's how we think about it, I think, really as something that needs to be changed, something that is a massive impediment to change, but something that, people organized collectively have the power to influence.
I just want to thank all of the panelists. Thank you so much. We learned a lot, and thank you for inspiring us and encouraging us to think of new and creative ways to challenge corporate power in the law. Thank you all.